Welcome to Communicating Now, Strategic Framing for Health Justice. My name is Merlene Tucker, and I'll be running today's web forum along with my colleague Jeff Bornstein. Today's web forum is sponsored by PHI Center for Health, Leadership, and Impact and produced by Dialogue for Health. Let's meet the moderator of today's event, Dr. Carmen Rita Nevarez. Carmen is a senior advisor at PHI Center for Health, Leadership, and Impact, founder of Dialogue for Health, and senior vice president emeritus of external relations and preventive medicine at the Public Health Institute. Welcome, Carmen.
Thanks so much, Marlene. I am really pleased to have everybody here and welcome you to today's web forum. We are just so happy to have you. Judging by the interest, there are over 1,450 people who've registered for this web forum. So we're hoping to have a really great conversation, and we can see that it's timely and the topic is interesting. And hopefully, based on your responses and your interaction with us, we'll really have the opportunity here to dig into some of the challenges of communicating today. I want to just remind everybody, please, we want to see what you have to say. So put your comments into the Q&A, put your questions into the Q&A. We'll do our best to make sure that we can have this as a very live conversation. And I'll be asking Dr. Sweetland a number of questions, and I'll incorporate what you are reacting to and asking about in my questions, so that we can just really keep this as involved and as interactive as possible. So with that being said, also feel free to give us reactions. We love the reactions. It really does help us get a sense of whether you're listening or whether you're there. So let me just start with a little brief interview for the PHI Center for Health, Leadership, and Impact. CHLI's mission is to advance health and equity by increasing the capacity of individuals and teams to transcend boundaries, work collaboratively, and transform their communities. Our programs help teams and individuals to build healthy, more equitable communities by developing multi-sector partnerships and leveraging your local resources. Let's go to the learning objectives. Next slide. There we go. One thing we hope from this is that we hope you will learn how to use strategic framing to talk about health justice in clear and impactful ways. We want to discover proven strategies to navigate tough conversations and stand firm on important health issues. And we hope you will gain practical tools for thinking through difficult decisions about communicating on health. Dr. Julie Sweetland is a sociolinguist and senior advisor at FrameWorks Institute. Since joining FrameWorks in 2012, Dr. Sweetland has designed and led reframing initiatives on climate change, education equity, childhood adversity, and more. Her skill in translating framing research into communication strategy has helped advocates, policymakers, and scientists drive change at the national, state, and grassroots level. Since 2017, Julie has worked primarily with the public health sector, bringing the science and strategy of framing to health topics like health equity, tobacco control, maternal mortality, and childhood vaccination. Prior to joining FrameWorks, Julie spent over a decade working in education reform as a classroom teacher, educator, and advocate. At Center for Inspired Teaching, she designed an innovative teacher residency, which has since trained hundreds of progressive educators who work throughout DC public schools. Julie's linguistic research has focused on the intersection of language and race, with a particular focus on how language can be used to disrupt racism in schools and beyond. Her research has appeared in the Journal of Sociolinguistics, Educational Researcher, and she's the co-author of African American, Creole, and Other Vernacular Englishes in Education. Dr. Sweetland is a graduate of Georgetown University and has completed her MA and PhD in linguistics at Stanford University. I'm really, really pleased that she is here to join us today in this conversation. We've had good conversations in the past. I know this one will be even better. Um, let's go to we can take the slide down and let me welcome Julie.
Thank you, Dr. Nevarez. It's good to be here, and it's great to see so many people on. I hope we're able to offer some guidance and a space to process and strategize.
We have a lot of work to do, and I know this is an audience really ready to roll up their sleeves and get into the substance. So what we want to do today is I will be asking Dr. Sweetland some questions, and some of those questions will really be framed up by what you, the audience, put up in the Q&A, so that we can see what the temperature of the audience is, how you're hearing things. So let me just start with one thing. With so many things happening right now, we've heard the term flooding the zone. What is the most important piece of communications advice you have to offer? Let's talk a little bit about what flooding the zone means and how it's impacting us right now.
Yeah. So, some political operatives have used the term flooding the zone as a way of characterizing an intentional strategy to have so many things happening, so many executive orders, so many actions at the federal level, so many controversial statements or even offensive statements that people who disagree with those points of view or those actions are don't know where to respond, right? There's kind of it's the world's worst and most active game of whack-a-mole, right? And we just can't keep up. In that, with so much happening, I think the most important piece of communications advice that I have to offer, and that I hope we all can take to heart, is just 5 words: prepare to respond, not react. And that's a simple sentence: prepare to respond, not react. But I think there's a lot packed into that. The first in that preparation is for each of us to do what we need to do to maintain our own poise and perspective. That's gonna be different for each of us. It could be taking the long view, right? Understanding that, of course, right now we see political and partisan dynamics affecting public health as an institution, but remembering that's not necessarily new. Many health topics are sensitive, controversial, and intersect with other social issues, and that's always been true. It could be to maintain your perspective and your own poise, deciding to focus on or at least prioritize one thing. There are issues within health justice and certainly beyond health justice that are likely affecting us personally, emotionally, or could concern us as, part of the civic body morally and intellectually. As individuals, we can't fight every fight. So perhaps, part of your preparation to respond is say, this is going to be my priority. For me, what I've decided in this time is that I'm going to use my skills and support for folks in ways that resist the worst impulses of the Make America Healthy Again movement, which I see as othering certain communities and undermining confidence in immunization. Your thing might be different, but that might be one way to prepare. Or it could be to decide to, some sort of self-care, right? Deciding to avoid sensationalized news, setting aside a time that something that renews your spirit or whatever it is. But the idea is to remember that you are a vital asset in this movement and in this moment, and we all need you to take care of yourself because we're counting on you. So take care of yourself, right? So you can help and work with on others. The second thing about not reacting is it's really important that we don't freeze or go into turtle shell mode. When a topic becomes polarized or politicized, let's say DEI, for instance, it's tempting to avoid it and kind of hope it will blow over. Um, that's not going to work. If voices on behalf of health justice, on behalf of humanizing ways of approaching health, if on behalf of science and evidence about how to lift population health overall, if our voices go silent, then all the public is going to hear is the negative kind of and polemical point of view. And that is in itself a danger. The strongest predictor of what people will believe is the number of times they have heard it. Not the only predictor, but it's a very strong predictor. And I think this means that we've got an obligation to make sure that people are hearing accurate, humane, and sound ideas about public health and health equity. It means we need to get out there and stay out there in the public square. And then the third thing I'll say about re- preparing to respond, not just react, is to recognize and get ready for the reality that we're all going to need to get really good at shifting perspective between the short term and the long term. And that's going to involve shifting, for instance, between crisis communications tactics and our long term strategies for shifting narratives and mindsets. There are definitely time sensitive challenges right in front of us right now that demand immediate action, right? The reality and the threat of deportations, the potential rollbacks of life saving public health interventions, how we communicate about those issues will shape how people perceive them and the actions that they do or don't take. But just preventing and reducing harm in the near term is not our only task. In the long term, we need to steer toward a very different geography of assumptions, attitudes, and social norms. So right now it feels like we're in the middle of a storm, and so it's hard to know how to allocate our resources and our attention, but the answer cannot be focusing only on the short term at expense of the big picture work. It has to be both. So we got to do the now stuff and keep our eyes on culture change, even and maybe especially when distractions abound. So all of this is a long way of saying, brush off your crisis communications plan and remember that it's not strategic to spend the next few weeks, months, or years in crisis comms mode. We need to really be thinking about long-term narrative and culture work.
That's really helpful. One of the questions that came up in the beginning is to get a good definition of health justice. Can you start with that?
Ah, well, I think again, I'm a linguist and I'm supporting folks that work in this area. And so some of the most effectively framed definitions I've heard include the idea that health justice is about making sure that every single person and every single community has a full and fair opportunity to be as healthy as possible, which involves specifically working to dismantle or redesign systems and structures that undermine people's health and working to build and promote living conditions, environments, opportunities that boost people's health. And so that's one definition that I think we can work with, but maybe other folks could add in the Q&A or point us to resources and a definition. Or Carmen, how do you all define it at Dialogue for Health?
Well, that could take a bit. It depends very much on the circumstance and what audience we're working with and who we're trying to have our conversation with. It's always important that you understand what are the values that the people that you're trying to speak to are, and to find a way to seek out that common language that is something that has some kernels that they can respond to and feel with. But basically, bottom line, it's moving in the direction of getting people a situation where they can have their healthiest possible life. It's hard to argue with that, although I know people do, but if we can agree that that's important, that's what I think, that's the direction we want to go in. Saying it that
Absolutely.
way doesn't work with everybody, as you well know. So we need to find what their language is and speak in a way where they recognize the words and they have some alliance with the values.
Yes, I mean, we've seen that values-based messages are especially important. Sorry, they are effective always. They are, I think, especially important right now. And I think that while where there's lots of politicization of certain aspects of health justice, for instance, the full inclusion, welcoming, and embracing of people who are transgender or have non-conforming gender identities, ensuring that people who are immigrants and undocumented immigrants have access to health, safety, well-being, health care, ensuring that we are rooting out the legacy of racism and the legacy of patriarchy in our health environments and our healthcare system. There are parts of the health justice movement that are being resisted, suppressed, and politicized right now, 100%. I don't think that means that we have to stop talking about health justice or health equity or whatever you choose to call it. One of the ways to keep having those conversations in the face of active efforts to suppress them is through exactly what you said, Carmen, those values-based messages. So in the research that we do at Frameworks, we do large, randomly assigned controlled survey experiments, that include people across geographies, across political affiliations, et cetera. And we're looking for what opens a door to a productive conversation on a social issue. And in recent studies, and you can find these on our website, I'll put the link in the chat in just a moment. We're finding that these values-based messages here on the screen are likely to be highly effective across audiences as a way to open the door to conversations on how to make our health environments fairer, more just, and more conducive to good health. So this message from Dignity, the idea that every person in every community has innate dignity, and our choices as a society should honor this and treat everyone with respect. That's one of those cherished values in society that people will act against that in all kinds of ways, but it's hard rhetorically to say, no, I don't believe some people have dignity, right? It's hard to be on the rhetorical opposite of that. So this is a one that we would recommend. And when we tested this recently in a national study with a rural oversample, we found it worked broadly, but also especially well in rural areas. And so you can think about that as one of the places where it's often the idea of health equity, for instance, has been mischaracterized or politicized. The idea of justice and say not just name dropping it, but explaining what you mean by it, that a fair and just society ensures that no person or group is unfairly exposed again and again, that we think to things that we know are harmful. Starting with that sentence, and then you move into what you're seeing that's harmful, whether that's longstanding public health issues and health equity issues like advertising and marketing of commercial tobacco saturated in certain communities, or whether it's new and newly sharpened and newly cruel language around people who are transgender or gender nonconforming. So that rhetoric is a form of harm, right? So I think that leading with our values is one thing that we can do to continue to have these conversations or move the policies, right, that are doing that work of health justice in a broader coalition than I think we have right now.
Um, that's such that that's really helpful. And I just want to say that I'm reading the questions and the comments from the audience, and I'm really impressed with the issues that you're bringing up. And I know we're not going to have enough time to cover all of them, but please continue to make them, continue to say what you need to say and to ask what you need to ask, and we will do our best to incorporate into our conversation what you're thinking and what you're feeling and struggling with right now. let me just for a second just pivot into a real quick one. What kinds of framing and messaging are especially important right now?
Yeah, I think so. Those values messages that I just talked about, I think are key. I'm scanning with one eye, some of the questions in there, and in the Q&A, and I think that addresses some of the issues. For instance, if you can't say health equity, you can certainly talk about dignity, right? And that ensuring that, when we are tolerating this issue, right, in this community, we're disrespecting people. And so that might be one of the soft alternatives, right? That by which a way of saying changing the words so we don't have to change the work, as in a phrase I borrowed from someone else. The other thing I think is going to be very critical right now is either developing ourselves or amplifying the work of others, humanizing stories about the people who are being scapegoated, right? So the way things are going right now, we'll have three new scapegoats by next week, right? But right now, it's trans folks, it's immigrant folks, and it's people who work in government, right? The federal workforce in particular, but all of us. And so, are there ways that um, without leaning into ranting or ridicule or lecturing, that we can simply remind people that these people are people, right? These people are our neighbors. And I'll put in the chat a great example of one campaign um, uh, run by GLAD. It's called We Are Here. As somebody who grew up in the 90s, I always get a Nirvana song going in my head. Here we are now, but that's not actually the name of it. And it's simply talking about showing like 70 odd percent of Americans think they've never met a transgender person. Whether they have or haven't, right? Another question, but they think they haven't. So it's easy to think, right, of this tiny minority as a exotic other that isn't really part of us, right? And so this type of campaign on in the to humanize folks who are being demonized, I think is another really important this story that type of storytelling tactic, I think is really important.
That's really helpful. There's a point that somebody made here that I really wanted to lift up. Um, let me see if I can find that again. Okay, the MAHA group, the Make America Healthy Again group, it's being defined currently in a very narrow way, so that it's focusing on chronic conditions and then leading into issues around the industry and ultra pasteurized,
Mhm.
uh, ultra processed foods, etc.
Mhm.
How can we? Do you think that we can take that over and make it broader in a consistent way, so that when we talk about America and health, we're talking about uh, a broad concept of health that is inclusive of the kinds of issues that we want to bring to the table, so that our issues don't get wiped
Yeah.
off the table?
Yes, I would not try to like co-opt the phrase "Make America Healthy Again." I see a lot of folks who don't agree with the agenda repeating that phrase, and I would advise against that. It's tempting to say, "Well, here's how you really make America healthy again," but I wouldn't be repping their brand for them if you don't see yourself as aligned with that. I do think the reason that the some of the ideas embedded in that group are resonating is because they tap into some very powerful, strong, and salient mental models that Americans have about health and about our systems. So, for instance, okay, so there's a system is rigged narrative that's being told by Maha. And it's that, for instance, that the powerful big pharma and big food are rigging our federal protective agencies to let bad stuff into the system, and therefore, right, the rest of us are getting unhealthy and inexplicable conditions, right, due to this modern impure stuff that's out there and all around us, right? So that's the narrative. That is a very powerful narrative. Our research from our Culture Change Project shows that 70% of Americans right now agree that the system is rigged. Now, who's rigging it, how, and for whose benefit and at whose expense, there's a lot of disagreement about. Our research has shown that it is dangerous to let that system is rigged narrative be owned only by the right, and that there are ways that those of us left of Attila the Hun can use that narrative to push for justice and change. So, talking about, for instance, one of the ways the system is rigged in America is structural racism. And that it's people, white, wealthy people, and the word wealthy, I know, is doing a lot of work there, but wealthy white people are rigging the system, twisting our founding principles in order to maintain power. And that means that people of color are systematically living in by large, more likely to, I should say, to live in conditions that don't promote health or that actively undermine health. And then we could use our collective power to live up to our ideals. That narrative, when we tested it recently, Republicans didn't like it. They said they disagreed with it, but it changed their minds. It made them less likely to support mass deportation and cutting immigration in half. Made them more likely to support things like expanding voting on Native American lands, increasing income supports for families. So I think that we should not try to play in their frame of make America healthy again, but we should not cede the narrative of the system is rigged. We should learn how to use it for good. And I'll stick a link to that resource in as well.
Very, very, very well said, I think. Thank you for that. Let me get to a couple of questions here from the audience that I think are pretty timely. Some people associate dignity with independence. How do we counter, especially now that the idea of dignity means that you do it on your own? You know, that whole kind of American sense of I did it myself, that, you know, nobody helped me, I made it on my own.
Yeah.
How do we counter that in a way that really can frame dignity and the importance of dignity, and bring that into the conversation?
I think it's an interesting question. I think it's about being careful to communicate what you mean by it. So individualism is, one of the foundational mental models in American culture. That sense of the rugged individual, right? A very dominant narrative. So I'm not dismissing that. But dignity, when you express it as our innate human worth, that we each have value as a person, and use that type of language or quotes from some of our moral leaders, right, who express that idea, that is a different value than self-sufficiency. Just conceptually, they're slightly different. So I think it's about being expressing your value very clearly.
That's very helpful. In So what do you think of this? In the jurisdiction where I work, we're using the language of health access in place of health equity. What do you think of that? And are there other ways to look at this?
Well, the phrase health access, I think it's not bad. It's not going to do anything like, offensive, right? Or something, but I think it will narrow people's understanding of the issue. They're going to think about healthcare access. If that's what you're talking about, great. It's a great term for you. But if your work is more upstream, more about the vital conditions for health in a community, I think that that term may end up painting you into a corner a little bit. So you might want to think about that. I think the search for the for the find and replace option for the phrase health equity or health justice is not smart enough for us right now. We have to be smarter than that, right? So we can explain what we mean by health equity, health access, health justice, whatever it is. And the explanation is actually more important than the label. So we talking about valuing each and every person in their health and each and every community in their health. That might be what you mean by it. Actively rooting out policies and programs that are unfairly exposing people to harmful stuff, whether that's racism or particulate matter or whatever it is, right? That can be what you're talking about. Say the say the say what you want to do and how you want to do it rather than worrying about your label and name to the extent that you don't say anything, right? Labels matter, but they're not they're not the whole. Naming is not reframing.
So in an environment where, the quick catchphrases are the things that are being set out, and what we as workers or as writers or as speakers need to counter, um, let me ask you to talk about that a little bit, and then let me just bring in a question from the audience. How are we supposed to work and fight towards health justice or equity when we're not even allowed to say those words out loud?
Yeah.
Do you have any strategies for continuing equity work under the current political administration?
So one thing is I want us all to take a moment and this is part of that respond, don't react. Are we not allowed? Is it that there's been a chilling effect? Or is it that you've actually been banned by your organization from saying that term? I know there are some people in this audience that is, right, actually what's happened. But for most of us, there has been, I am not aware that we're not allowed. And so I'll borrow this mantra from the historian Tim Snyder, who is a historian of authoritarianism. Don't obey in advance. By which he means, I think he means, you know, don't give up your power and your voice because you think something might happen. Wait, continue to speak, continue to work on issues unless and until, right? You really, really can't. And I know while there are people in the room who have been banned from saying X, Y, or Z, there are also going to be people in this room where you may be putting yourself at physical risk, or some other type of risk that you personally can't take on. So I'm not dismissing that. But all of us, I want to encourage us all to not freely give up our power and our voices as a immediate and anticipatory response to efforts to suppress ideas. If we give in as a sector to the chilling effect, we are in for some chilling times. That said, if you really are in a position where you can't say the thing, here is and there's one word today. I have it. Surely the next politicized term is just around the corner. So rather than giving you a list of, synonyms, I think that this is the strategic response. Like, how do you think through what to do when your word has been, or a word, right, has been politicized? The question I would start with is that idea that word is communicating helpful and productive or harmful and unproductive? So if it's helpful and productive, if you can, don't obey in advance, continue to use the term. If you can't, find a close synonym. Either way, again, the explanation is more important than the label. For instance, folks, I know we're all sad probably that we feel like we can't say equity, but to be frank, most Americans, when we've studied the issue, most Americans thinks equity means how much you've paid down your mortgage. So even using that word was not doing what we thought it was. The explanation has to be part of this. Make it simple, make it nonpartisan. And whatever you're doing, whether you can say the word or can't or will or won't, don't make that decision only as an individual or with an organization. Be in conversation with your allies, with your peer institutions. So those of us, like as the poll said, 50% of us are in government. We may be in a position where we literally can't say that thing. Can we work with our NGO sector partners, supporters, allies to keep saying the thing? Do we have conversation about the thing? Now, what if the idea is harmful and unproductive? For a long time, I was using critical race theory as my example here, but right now I want to pick on the phrase radical gender ideology. All right, so I consider that term harmful and unproductive, to say the least. So if that, in that case, it is a politicized term, meaning it is being used for political purposes. So in that case, don't repeat the term. Instead, talk about the intent and the impact of that harmful idea. What is that term trying to do? It is trying to suggest that some people's experiences and self-expression are false and misleading and disingenuous, when really this is an example of people being who they are and living their truth, right? I worry, right? This is kind of thing I worry, right? That using language like that is dismissing many of those, dismissing the reality of many of those in our community. It is trying to single out a tiny minority as a scapegoat. And I worry that it's causing immediate harm to the young people who are working through, their identity, right? Something like that. That's not word perfect, but I don't repeat the term. Talk about what that harmful term is doing. And again, these are not conversations we should be having only in our heads, right? Or only with two of us in an organization. They should be larger sector-wide conversations like the one we're having right now.
So let me push that idea a little bit further and ask you, how do you respond when you're having a discussion about some issue that where the group you're talking to, the person you're talking to, is denying um, an individual or a group's humanity? What do you say? How can you respond when, how do you make any common ground when the people you're talking to do not believe that everyone is equally deserving of health?
I think that's a point where we need to think more strategically about our audience and what we want to accomplish with each audience. So, there are people who are, by definition, immovable opponents. Right? They are immovable opponents to the idea that um, immigrants are part of the fabric of our society. Right? They are immovable opponents to that idea. Our goal is not to persuade them, right? Our goal is to reclaim conversational territory from them. We want to ensure that people who might be open to that point of view but are not strongly wedded to it are hearing the conversation in ways that we are positioning ourselves as the more reasonable party in an important and inclusive conversation. It's about ensuring that people who could go that way instead come our way, because we have used an invitational rhetoric, not an argumentative rhetoric. And I don't mean we shouldn't have a strong argument, but if the people who aren't the immovable opponents, right, they're kind of skeptical or they don't have an opinion yet, if all they hear is that getting involved means getting in a fight or there they go again, right? Then you're sending people to their predefined corners. And it's really easy, right? It's easy for the folks who are dehumanizing to tap into long-standing narratives and really do harm, right? For folks who are being scapegoated. So too long didn't read. Remember that immovable person is not your audience. It's the people they might listen. It's their audience is your audience. right? The people they're trying to persuade are the people you're trying to persuade, and develop your tactics, your tone, your arguments, your frames accordingly.
So let me just go back to that idea a little bit. It sounds as though what we need to do is what you're talking about is that we need to remember that there are people who are immovable, and that those may not be the people who we really need to invest our time trying to convince differently, but rather think about the people who listen to them, or maybe even the people who are in the middle and don't know who to listen to. And how do we become credible for those folks in a way that they can hear, and it maybe even potentially immunizes them a little bit against
Yeah.
the immovable folks that are committed to dehumanizing or to truly unjust values.
Yeah, I think that that point of this is a term that gets used a lot in the misinformation literature, the literature encountering misinformation, is inoculating people against those sorts of beliefs and messages. The other thing is, I want us to be encouraged that although there are kind of vocal vectors for really ugly stuff right now, I want us to remember to normalize, continue to normalize the idea that we are a diverse nation. That is part of our strength and our beauty. Of course, we haven't always embraced that diversity as fully and as fairly as we should have. But we have a chance to make it better and make it right now. Most Americans believe those things. Somebody can ban the term diversity. It's going to take a whole lot of work to walk back the idea that diversity is a good thing in America. People have done the work to build that mental model in. And I'm not saying it's not vulnerable, and I'm not saying it's universally shared, but it is strong and it is a salient idea. And so to kind of cede, to give up, right, on reminding people of that right now doesn't feel like the right move to me. Um, yeah, that's what I'll say there.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So that one of our audience members commented that right now it seems like inconsistency of messaging is being perceived as making those messages untrustworthy. So how do we balance shifting our language and framing to align with the values of different audiences in a way that we are being consistent so that we don't turn people off by making them think that we're untrustworthy?
Yeah, there's always it's a good question. It's a really smart, astute question there. There's, I think, a balance between substance shifting and style shifting, right? So we talk to congregations in sermons, and we talk to policymakers in budget bullet points, right? I mean, there's stuff that you have to change to match your audience. I don't think your values messages should be one of those things. The consistent values of things, those intrinsic values like dignity, shared humanity, and protection from injustice, a fair shot, those kinds of high level ideas. I would advise being consistent on those. One, for the reason the questioner stated, which is if you're flip flopping all around, right, it does make you look opportunistic, right, or disingenuous or something like that. But two, because one of the strongest predictors of what people will believe is the number of times they've heard it. And so if we are diluting our message by saying efficiency over here and fairness over there, right, we haven't harnessed the power of repetition. Thinking about being consistent there. I do think that one of the places it is important to shift and talking about health equity and health justice issues are the examples that you give. So, really explaining, right, how a particular underlying inequity came about through a historical example, showing how that's affecting today, and then showing a better future, that past, present, future framing of how we got this disparity, right? That's really effective. But the example you give, tailoring that to your audience. So, in the research I referenced earlier, we found that leading with the idea that transportation affects health and lack of transportation can affect health and well-being in many ways, that was particularly resonant with rural audiences. And then that gives you a space where you can, with that audience, move into other forms of injustice that are also affecting rural communities, that may be along lines of race, ethnicity, occupation, gender, sexuality, gender expression, immigrant status, et cetera, right? But you start with something that people can resonate with. I wouldn't be shifting my values, audience to audience. I'd be moving examples, and maybe my asks, my calls to action, the proposals I want people to support.
So be clear about your values and consistent about your values, and think about your strategies or the examples in a way that's tailored to the audience and what the audience can hear and align with.
Yeah, I think that's, thank you for that summary. I went on for a bit there.
No, I just wanted to say it again because because as you say,
Yeah.
we'll believe the things that we hear. So maybe we can believe and internalize these approaches. So there was a really first of all, there are 75, 76 questions up there and comments. And so keep them coming because they're wonderful. And I really appreciate your willingness to participate in this way. So much better when you're facing an audience of 800 people to know that a bunch of them are really in it with you because you are part of this conversation. You really make the conversation rich and worthwhile. Talk a little bit about navigating conversations when multiple values are being pitted against each other, like, for example, human
Mm.
dignity versus government efficiency. So how do we parse that?
Whew. Right, that is kind of the big question. Um, so zero sum thinking, or a zero sum framing is highly effective because it's easy for people to think I can have this or I can have that, right? I can pick this or I can pick that. The best framing move, is to name that, say, hey, this is, a false dilemma, or this issue is being oversimplified, and I worry, right? We're kind of worry aloud. My concern is that for our community, that means, right, we're making short-sighted decisions, unwise decisions, um, say if it's going to be a problem, right? Now, that's again, my tone here is tempting to be firm yet warm. In teacher school, they told us to call that firmth when you're in the front of the classroom, like, I love y'all students, but you can't run me over, right? It's like that sort of thing. Um, and then give examples, right? Examples of um how that choice, like that we actually have three choices. You're telling me I've only got two, but we've actually got three. I think it's important that we not try to do that in a refute or fact check or gotcha kind of way, as people like the media is doing plenty of that. They said Doge saved $55 billion. Really, it's, 55 cents or whatever it is, And so, plenty of voices will be doing that from those of us that are kind of making change from within the system. I think that, the concrete examples being specific, is one thing. The other thing is that question is, well, how do we fight the big villain in this moment, right? How do we and I think that part of that is look for side doors into conversations about these health justice topics or the policies that are being really harmful. So earlier I said we have to stay in the public square. Right now I'm going to say that doesn't mean we have to square off, right? Tit for tat, he said, CDC said, right? Debates aren't going to be particularly helpful. Again, if our framing leaves people thinking, oh my goodness, there they go again, a lot of people are going to tune out and turn away. And we need to reclaim public discourse as a civic dialogue about shared projects. We need to reclaim public discourse as a shared dialogue about civic shared projects, right? And so finding styles, channels, and themes of communication that invite people to think through an issue, not just reflexively pick a side or run away, is going to be one thing we can do. So we've been entering the conversation through front doors like this. The science and evidence are on our side. Health inequities are rooted in systemic racism, patriarchy, and other forms of oppression. Vaccines are safe and effective. All three of those things are true, meaning they are sound social analyses, but they might not be our best communication analyses right now. Instead of leading with scientific authority, the science says, we can lead with an expression of care and concern for community. The old, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care sort of thing. Instead of framing with big bad systems, we can frame with specific examples, past, present, future. How did this particular inequity in this community happen? And what can we do about it? And instead of reminding people of the manufactured controversy about vaccines or transgender people or whatever it is, we can move the conversation to a different space, right? We can talk about how um, immunization is a platform for keeping kids doing what they do best, learning, growing, thriving, riding their bikes, reading books, right? We can talk about our neighbors and their in more humanizing ways. So I think the other thing is just because they're attacking does not mean we have to treat it like a war in front of the people we're trying to persuade.
Yeah. So really good comment here. Everyone likes to learn, but no one likes to be taught. Do you have suggestions for how to introduce health equity materials that lean into people's need for a sense of self-discovery?
That is a really okay. That's gonna be my second mantra after don't obey in advance. I will point you all to self-discovery. No, no, I haven't thought about that one yet. Who stumped me? I want their name. I'm gonna follow up with them.
I'll send you the quote.
Okay.
I thought it was a really
It is good. It is
a
good.
really useful nugget for us to sort of roll around a little bit.
Mhm.
Um, so let's talk for a minute about here is a really interesting question. Get and I'll just read it. I'll read it in its entirety. Might be getting ahead of the presentation a bit, but I'm wondering, as we're thinking about shifting the big picture and leaning into long-term narrative change, do you have recommendations for message dissemination? My concern is that even if we craft compelling and persuasive stories and messages, public health as a field struggles to identify or invest in strategies to reach policymakers or our communities or anyone who doesn't already know and agree with us really. It's a big complex chunk. So let's sort of break that one down.
Yeah. Tactics, channels, dissemination, kind of 360-degree saturate the discourse thinking is not my top expertise. I definitely have colleagues here at Frameworks who do think about that, and think about bringing in um, non, you know, building a coalition or setting a table of different ways to communicate with folks, right? Through community organizers and those face-to-face communicators, or face-to-face, conversations, folks that are doing, promotores or other community health workers who are having that more back and forth conversation with folks, all the way to entertainment media, right? So working with folks like the Norman Lear Center or the Center for Scholars and Storytellers that really infuse sound health messages and health ideas and justice messages into television and advertising and children's media and that sort of thing. So I'll say take a look on our website, the work on narrative shift. We'll have a lot more in there, and in the weeks ahead, we've got a really cool new resource coming out, supported by a grant from the Packard Foundation that gets to exactly that question. But it is that a tactic of, okay, you're telling us what to say and what not to say, but how do we make sure people encounter it and hear it, right? That is following it to its logical conclusion.
Cool. So no matter where we are right now, we're clearly in a very polarized and politicized environment and conversation. So it's true for everybody, regardless of where you're working, whether you are part of a community or whether you are working on a particular topic area. So what do we do? How can we set ourselves up the best so that we can navigate this kind of terrain that's just so threatening and challenging?
Yeah. So I mean, I think some of what I said earlier about looking for the side doors is really that is it, right? You know that there's the boxing ring, right? That's happening on your thing. Can you can you still stay in the public square but not but figure that out? So I can think of, for instance, our partners working on climate change years ago developed a strategy to work to train up the interpreters, the docents at zoos and aquariums that stand in front of the kelp or the tuna or the dolphin or whatever it is. And people come up and ask questions, and their strategy was no matter what question you ask, all questions lead to climate change, right? And they had a way of talking about it that was depoliticizing the issue. I think about our partners in early childhood who spent a lot of time, some of the scientists on the National Scientific Council of a Developing Child, who spent a lot of time giving like scientific talks and bringing the science to the legislators and just watched like vote after vote uh, as if it never even happened. And so instead, they developed a tabletop game called the Brain Architecture Game that engaged people in building a structure. If you know, you got each turn, each kind of year in a child's life, you got a pipe cleaner, and if they got a supportive experience, you also got a straw. And can you build a sturdy structure as a metaphor, right, for what it takes to support a child's development? And if you play that with a legislature, right, then you get an internalized experience. So, can we think about those channels, places, and spaces that get us out of like, um, does it have to be on social media? Like, can we have it can we have that conversation in another way? Sometimes it does, but social media, we know, amplify is the fastest way to spread mis and disinformation. It brings out people's negativity bias, meaning people are more likely to pay attention to, it kind of amplifies people's negativity bias. And people are more likely to pay attention to things that are bad, sad, you know, that sort of thing. And it people that conversation is fragmented politically by age, and it leads people to be kind of more argumentative and dismissive, right, than they might be in other settings. So some of this is going to have to be about tactics, the places, spaces, and actual materials we're creating to communicate. Do we have to have the expert in the front in the audience in the big in the rows of chairs, or can we set it up so we're in a circle? You know, any of those sorts of things, right? But I think that is part of depolarizing this in this moment.
So I've been thinking a lot lately about how do we have conversations about rights and justice and who we are as a society and as a community in a way that doesn't in a way that sort of counters the othering narrative, and how do we create the conversational space in which we're really talking about all of the components, all of the various um, people and communities being a part of the society. And somebody raised an interesting question about the issue of tokenism, which is sort of the other side of
Mhm.
that, you know, of this frame. um, a presentation heard at the Agents of Change conference just the last couple of days about tokenism and how that may also lead to some of our priority frontline communities feeling as though they're being used as a political weapon. So, how do we not fall into that?
That's also a really interesting question, and something I think that needs to be talked about again in community, in coalition. So I've been, you know, in rooms where you know, school board folks knowing they were going into a school board meeting where issues of LGBTQ plus representation and teaching, accurate, honest teaching of race and racism in the curriculum, there were going to be people there kind of pushing, rate complaining about those things and trying to suppress those ideas. And that coalition strategically chose, you know what, we're putting the most like cis hetero white guy in our group up to be the messenger that day, right? So that this is not, it's not, that is not only a belief and value system shared by by the minoritized community, but it's a broader sort of thing. There are also times um, when that doesn't make sense, right? When it's really important for people who are closest to the problem being most effective to be leading the decision making, leading the strategy, and leading as spokespeople. So I don't think there's one right answer. There is not one right answer to that question, but keeping that question in mind, how are we making sure we're neither otherizing nor tokenizing? We're not treating people instrumentally, right? That is, I think that's the key question to keep in mind.
So, again, your questions are fabulous and your comments are amazing. So please keep them coming. What recommendations do you have for messaging when people claim they are against evidence-based public health intervention due to their religious beliefs?
Hmm. Um, so again, I think are you trying to, a question of who is your audience and what is your goal? If your goal is behavior change for that person, then the methods and the communication strategies are going to be around motivational interviewing, building a relationship, over time, building trust in the public health sector, intervention, immunization, whatever it is, so that that person will, one hopes, accept that intervention. So if your goal is behavior change, that's one set of strategies. But if your goal is discourse change, right, remember that that person is necessary, not necessarily, you're not going to change that person's mind, but can you change their perception of who public health is as a sector? Are we being paternalistic? Are we ridiculing them? Are we inadvertently or explicitly sending the message, your perspective doesn't matter, we know better? That's not going to help, right? That is going to harden that person's feelings, likely could activate them as a more vocal vector, right? More vocal opponent of the thing. It's not just their personal choice. Now they want to war everybody, right? And burn down the whole thing. And also the people who are close to them, right? The people who and their networks. Um, how are you positioning yourself as a messenger? So if we are being, if we're coming at people with blame, shame, and derision, because they don't believe our evidence, we're definitely not going to get them to believe our evidence, and their friends aren't going to believe, or their friends are more likely to go with them than us, right? So thinking about that. Overall, I think the other thing we can do is think about the distinction between inviting people into understanding science versus appealing to scientific authority. So consensus says 99% of scientists agree. The preponderance of the research shows, all those kinds of ways that we signal. It's almost like a virtue signaling thing at this point within public health, that we are, that we're doing the evidence-based thing, and as if that should win, right, the argument. I am all for evidence. I don't want us to start doing unevidence-based things, but can we ask people to say, here's the puzzle, right, that we were trying to figure out as public health. How is it that, we can work on the fact that 50% of women who, I think this is right, a whole lot of women who are pregnant and have hepatitis B don't know it, and it can get passed on, right? So how we thought about how to do that. So what we did was we checked to see if that vaccine was safe for infants, and it was. And we decided that the way to get the biggest bang for our buck, protect the most kids, prevent that long-term problem, was dosing at an early age. And so that's the thinking, right? That's different than all the studies have said it's fine, right? And so again, inviting people into your expertise versus beating them over the head with it. I think that's one thing to try.
Yeah, I really like that. I want to underscore that, when we say as providers of information, whether we're the teacher or the health provider or the parent, we say this is what it is. It's heard in a very different way than if we talk about this is why it is. Breaking
Yeah.
it down into the pieces that somebody can then internalize and build into their way of thinking because it makes sense for them.
Absolutely. They are reasoning for themselves along with you, right? And that does a couple of things. One, they can you get they get a little dopamine boost when people have that satisfying sense that they get how it works. That lights our brains up. That makes your message more memorable. It makes people happier. It makes them like you. Like it does all the things that dopamine does, right? But it's also, I think, from our point of view, we started off by one of our definitions of health justice and health equity was valuing people and their perspective. I don't agree with a lot of the perspectives that people are holding. But I feel like I have to hold myself ethically to the idea that they have a right to bodily autonomy, and I need to respect the fact that they can hold that opinion in that space. And so I need to demonstrate that through my messaging as well. And so if we're not doing that, if we're only asserting and never explaining, we're really not demonstrating respect for them. And so why would they? Why would they come over to our side?
Really good point. Thank you for that. Let me have you talk a little bit more about audience strategy and comms strategy within this context. So in particular, given the current administration and their agenda, do you see any potential issues that they support that public health can build on? Or is this administration really outside of our political audience, potential audience, given their actions?
Oh, Carmen and questioner, that is a very important question. And I am not the right expert to handle that. So I'm going to ask for us to go to the next one.
Okay. So this is good, audience. You're giving us some really good food for thought and for the next few web forms that we do. So let's I want to go back to one comment that one of the audience members made a few minutes ago, and I think it's really important for all of us to hear and sort of think about this for a bit. Um, I'm an MPH student, and this is so inspiring. I'm also an undocumented student, and prospects look bleak.
Mhm.
Um, for all of you out there who may be in uncertain status or feeling like you are in certain status, whether that's because of your citizenship or because of your job that you feel is imperiled, this is a really hard time, and we're hoping by having more of these conversations that you feel included and you feel nurtured and you feel like we hear you. I think this is just a really important opportunity for you to let us know that you're out there, and for us to let you know that we're out there as much as we can be with you, and that we hear what you say. So thank you for saying it, and thank you for sharing it. It matters that we know that you're part of us, and that we're part of you.
Absolutely. And that very first point around self-care, right? Ensuring, right, that and that we have to do the immediate thing and the long-term thing, right? All of us could be sharing, amplifying really good stuff like ACLU, know your rights, and which is, what to do, right, in the moment, where a person may be threatened by ICE or other law enforcement. And right, work with groups like Welcoming America and other groups that are very much about a long-term culture shift around welcoming, embracing, celebrating and newcomers, right, to our nation. And so that both and work is going to be one of the ways that we can support and embrace, right, the undocumented folks among us and other scapegoated folks in this moment.
So we have just a few more minutes, and I want to make sure that maybe we can get some quick answers here. There's a couple of really good questions. Yeah, there's great stuff.
Lightning round, let's do it. All right.
There's great stuff here. Are there any tools, maybe an online tool, that you'd suggest for checking the literacy level of our messaging?
Oh, yes. Okay, the one I always use is just readabilityformulas.com. I don't know that it's the best one, but it's the one that I've used for years and years. And I like
repeat that again for me.
Readabilityformulas.com. I just put it in the chat. I like it because I'm a word nerd, and it told me like the score on the 6 different like readability tests, and so that's why I liked it. Somebody else might have a better one. I will also say that my latest hack for lowering the readability level of my work is just to use AI. I don't take exactly, I put in my public health stuff. I let it spit it back to me. I say, simplify this, write this at a 5th grade level. I can't take every word it says brings back to me, because sometimes they've made it much more individualizing than what I liked. Or maybe they used a word that I know is just kind of not cool anymore. It's like on the verge of being offensive to some people or something, right? Like you can't just take it, but it gets me out of my own expert head. And wow, spiciest thing I've said is use AI. I love this. There's reactions all over the place. But yes, one of the ways of demonstrating respect for our readers and one of the ways of being more powerful messengers is to do the hard work of making our ideas easy to understand.
Yeah, thank you. So let's see, there's another, this is something that I think is really important. If our organization or role is not focused on policy change, please explain how we can still use these framing strategies.
I think it probably depends on what your work is focused on. But I learned from a brilliant colleague at the University of Buffalo that policy, her definition of policy, is any group that is made to act or not act. Sorry, any decision that is made to act or not act by a group. All right. So you're working on policy somehow. Whether or not it may not be big P policy, legislation, but maybe you're in a department, right? And you have practices like things that your organized group will or will not do. And so you can think about how are you getting institutions to respond? And if in whatever way your work is in that's when these strategies can come in.
Yeah, one of the things I want to just compliment our participating audience for is that a number of the questions that are raised or the points that are raised, the idea that you are engaging in answering as well as helping to throw in your own insights and references, that's so helpful. So please, always know that we completely support that. And we think that these should be as broad as possible in the kind of input that we take. So we want to make sure that you all know that we value this. And so I'm not reading everything because I don't have days in the year to do that. But everything you say, we see, and we do try to do something with it. So let's see here. At what point do you think the system is too rigged in terms of the narrative to address things like vaccines? Do we get to that point? Can we still keep pushing what we know to be the good science? Are there subjects that we need to leave alone for a while and come back to later? Or what do we need to do when something gets so polarized?
Yeah. Well, when the work gets harder, that means it's more important. And history shows us that it is exactly these moments of disruption and chaos in which something will take root. Disruptive moments, whether that's political upheaval, public health crises, they tend to highlight the inadequacy of existing ways of thinking about problems. And by doing that, they increase people's willingness to think differently about what's required to fix them. So, moments when moments like this are important moments in the long-term narrative change work world. So that is true. Whether or not this is the season in your state to go toe to toe with a particular legislator about a particular bill, right? Or to press for one particular incremental change, I can't say that as somebody not in your context, right? But I think that the answer to that question lies in the short term response versus the long-term narrative and culture change work. So keeping that in mind as you're wrestling with those. I did just put in the chat an example of how to manage, it's the classic PR technique called bridge and pivot, but how to do that on some of the most common forms of pushback to vaccine policy. I'm not the person to tell you how to get people to get the jab, but Frameworks has a lot of I think interesting ideas on how to reclaim and change the public discourse on vaccination access and policy. So too long to didn't read. If it's getting hot, that is the point where you have to be most strategic and not just stay out of it by default or out of fear that there is no perfect response, right? Seeking excellence, seeking perfection is demoralizing. Seeking excellence is motivating. That's a quote from Dr. Harriet Breaker. And so thinking about what's the most strategic response now, it might be say nothing, but you shouldn't reach that just because I feel like there's too much going on. It should be a very purposeful choice.
So let me share a thought from the audience because I really appreciate this. I feel sometimes a part of the discord strategy is to make us feel alone. And this discussion makes me feel the opposite.
Well, if that's not a segue into the closing poll, I don't know what is, Dr. Nevarez.
Well, we actually have enough time for just one last quick question.
Okay.
The ideas that you've explored so far have really, they sound so promising, but they're also complex. So if you're not in the position to implement them, how can we actually know that these ideas could work? How do we know, how do I do that? You know, what is the thing I can do to be engaged in rethinking and reframing and restating the things that we believe in and that we're trying to move forward?
Yeah. I think the most important thing any of us can do is join a group. I don't know which group that is, right? Because there are hundreds of you on this call, but we need to organize, strategize, and harmonize with our allies. That's all my rhymes for the day. And I'm going to say a couple because we have to. These are complicated decisions. They're multifaceted. It's not that there's no answer, but we need a lot of perspectives to get to that answer. And then I just want to say two things. If it ever feels like the immediate work isn't working, I'll return to two points that I've made already that I think can help you stay encouraged. In the immediate moment, just because you get a negative response or you suffer a loss, that doesn't mean you didn't have an impact, right? So that very cool experimental finding that my colleagues just published on the effect of talking about systemic racism with a system is rigged narrative, people who describe themselves as Republican were more likely that they disagreed with it. That's what they say. But the second finding was that they expressed very different policy opinions than their counterparts who didn't, right? So the right frame, people might not agree with it, but it can shift their thinking, right? So if you're feeling like, oh my God, that didn't go well, you have one piece of data. You don't have all the data. I would encourage you to stay encouraged. And the other is just in that long run that, again, history shows that moments like this, these disruptive moments, are exactly the time when we should lean into that long-term work. That long-term work is always, it only works if it's done in coalition and in community. So join a group. Join a group.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for all of that. We've covered so much ground, and I know there's still so much more ground to cover, but at least we've had the opportunity to have this last hour and a half. I want to thank you, Julie. I think you've done just an amazing job. I want to thank the audience for being such an engaged audience and just giving us so much good food for thought. I love it when the audience raises questions that we're not ready to, not prepared to answer, but that means that we still have more work to do, and we know we have more work to do, and keep reminding us of that. Um, again, thank you, Julie. You've just done such a good job of sharing your insights and all the work that you've done, everything that's gotten to this point. And then let's just sort of keep this going, keep this rolling, keep this energy going. A lot of work to do out there. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please take a moment to complete the short survey, and you can find the link in the chat now. And thank you, everyone, for being part of today's discussion. Goodbye, and we'll see you next time.